name is Alex Christoff, born in Cleveland, Ohio in January 1940. Was born above a bar. Then we moved to another location where the bar was across the street. Well, luckily in modern day terms, we didn't have words like dysfunctional and compulsive or things like that. But from a Hungarian-Ukrainian descent family of hard-working, steel-working, heavy-drinking people, it was a family of drunks. And every Friday that I can remember from the time I was 3 years old, every Friday the city police of Cleveland would come over and raid our house. Not the bar next door, but our house, because our family was all drunked up and fist fighting and throwing bottles at each other. It was a very crazy way to grow up. I have a younger sister, but at that time she wasn't born yet. She's 4 years my junior. And from there we moved to another locale in a small suburb called Parma, Ohio. As an adolescent, I had free rein to pretty much learn to do whatever I wanted to do on my own. There was no supervision whatsoever, as long as I visually looked like I was present and doing the right things. And my first job was when I was 10 years old, because I had two uncles in Parma, Ohio that were working the golf course, and I learned to carry a golf bag because they did it before me and they were 3 or 4 years older than I. And from there I learned what young people do as far as getting into the gambling atmosphere. We learned to pitch coins and play various card games, and everything was competitive and usually for small amounts of money, and there was a certain mystique of excitement of doing that kind of situations. With the early stages of learning what I learned from my uncles and my surrounding element of people, I just gravitated towards games of chance or possibly minor dishonest things. I think most boys, unsupervised, possibly steal things, small items, candy bars, jewelry, cap guns, bicycles, whatever happens to be available. Produce, we come from a farm community, people that have apple trees, orange trees, or whatever, tomatoes. More than one person could eat, so we would take whatever we wanted. We went through life taking whatever we wanted, pretty much. Because of whatever charisma I may have, I would gather the local guys that we would play baseball, football, basketball with, and I would invite them over to my house and say, you ever play blackjack, or you ever play poker? And we all learned together. And I happened to be the guy, and my parents were so liberal, they liked to have young people around. We would come over to my house, we would go into my basement, we'd go into my bedroom, and I would promote all these games of chance for all the local 10 through 18-year-old kids. And since my parents allowed it, because they thought it was nice that I was so popular, I would seem to be one step ahead of everybody else who was doing it for the fun of it, and I was doing it for the money and the fun of it, or the excitement. After I got out of high school, I had a job working at a grocery store, similar to an Albertsons or a Smith's or Food King or whatever you want to call them. And I met my wife, who was my high school sweetheart, and I started dating this girl in between all my gambling endeavors, and her father gave me a job working for him. And at this food store, they would always be shooting craps or flipping coins or in the coolers of the grocery store. So I was in an element that was perfect, and her dad was just a nice man who liked to play and didn't have the genetics to play it well. He just liked to play, so I was always successful. I seemed to be a cut or two above my clientele, so to speak. And all of the supervisors of the grocery store would meet at his house twice a month and play quarter half poker, and he invited me, since I was dating his daughter, to play with them. And I'll never forget that he, at one point, I went beyond my means because these guys are now in their 40s, and I lost $100, which he loaned me, and they had renovated their home. They had 3 big mounds of dirt, as you do when you excavate, and he had me move the mounds of dirt from his yard into a big field to pay back the $100 that I couldn't pay back at the time, and I never forgot that. And then, as we progressed, he took me to 2 of these Italian joints in my this was now Sandusky, Ohio. We went to these 2 Italian places, and I was 17 years old, 18 years old, and I got to play with 40 and 50-year-olds, and I was absolutely in awe of being in this atmosphere. Now it had graduated. Now I'm winning money from 17 and 8-year-olds, but now I'm going up against 40-year-olds. So you learn your shortcomings along the way. It's just like going from grade school to high school to college. And I've watched these people do that, and I imitated them at the 17-year-old level. I'd get my kids around, and then I'd deal my own game. And that's how I fell into that kind of a situation. So I've always, since I was 12 years old, I've always organized games, and again, through my father-in-law, I met a few people, and then just gradually expanded my horizon with contacts. The first time I won $1,000 was in a crap game 20 miles away from Lorain, and I had, at that time, a $100 bill was a lot of money, but of course, when I was in high school, I would have a $100 bill every week from the other kids. But then an older person that I met through my father-in-law told me about this crap game in Lorain, which was definitely old time, just people. They were all 40 years old, and I learned how to. Oscar Goodman wrote a book. It was called Beat the Dealer, and he's not Oscar Goodman, but it might have been, it was a Goodman, Mike Goodman, that was his name. He's a professional gambler, and his thing was how to progressively shoot craps. And I ended up running into a big hand and won $1,000, and went out and bought presents for my mom and dad and sister and so on, and my girlfriend at the time. It was pretty exhilarating, obviously, for a teenager to win $1,000. That was pretty monumental. Later on in life, I won a couple big scores here in Las Vegas. But the first 1,000 is always really great. I joined the U.S. Navy in '59. My high school sweetheart got tired of me standing her up on date nights on Fridays and Saturdays because I was going to various gambling ventures, and she broke up with me. I thought that was kind of a humorous story as I retell it. And in order to get her back, and I told my parents I went down to the Navy recruiter, and I signed up for the Navy recruiting office. And I told everybody I leave in 15 days. And of course, if you know anything about the service, you don't actually join until you get to the final spot and you take the step and all that other stuff. They'd give you this oath. So for 2 weeks, I was a celebrity in my town. Oh, you're leaving, oh, please don't go. And my girlfriend got back with me, and it went on, and for like 13 days, everybody would say, oh, please, why did you do it? You should stay home. And then when I'm getting ready to say, okay, I won't go, nobody said it anymore. So I had to go into service because I had told everybody I was going to go, so I ended up going into Navy. So then I went in from 59 to 63. But it was all a bluff. And they finally called it when I would have backed out. They said, no one said nothing, please stay home. So I went. And ironically, 2 years later, we married the girl, and she's been with me pretty much off and on we've been together 60 years with 3 little reprieves in between the rocky road that I traveled. The gambling in the military, just like there are so many 18, 19, and 20-year-old people in the service, and you get paid every couple of weeks, and through the boredom of boot camp, and again, the intangible trait that I have of acquiring a position where I can manipulate. I manipulated. They made me in the Navy they called it a master at arms. You usually have a company commander, assistant company commander, and the astute guy that teaches everybody could see that I had some type of leadership qualities, but not, there were so many other ones that had leadership qualities, so they gave me a badge as a master at arms or a security cop. And as a security cop, I got to direct. I played the music for the marches, I organized work parties, I did all kinds of scenarios like that. And I was, when the companies would march up, I would move people to where they went to eat, when they went to the recreation areas, which is a pretty good, powerful position to be in. And then we'd come back to the barracks at night. You know, because of this position I was in, everybody would want to gravitate towards things that I could do for them. And we would organize, again, poker games, crap games, whatever the case might be, and they just, I would suggest it, they would go for it, and I would subsidize my living with it, just by the natural organizational ability that I seem to have. Once I got out of the service, I opened up, again, I had my wife and 2 sons with me my last 6 months in the service. We came back home, I got jobs just like everybody else does, and once I got home, the kids that grew up with me in Sandusky, Ohio knew I was now out of the service, and I formed a basketball team that we played City League basketball and traveled all over the state, and I organized poker games, crap games, and gambling of chance, football pool tickets. You see these back in Ohio, they're illegal of course, but you could pick them up at the local stores. And I would be the guy who had the contact, so I would pick up the tickets, give them out to the guys, take the money back in, start the poker game every Friday when everybody gets paid in Ohio. And it just word of mouth, word of mouth, word of mouth, and I kept running poker games, and everybody'd call into work and miss work and come back, and it got so big at my house, I had to rent another house, and then we would do that, and after a month or two, the police would hear about this illegal poker game, and they'd come knock on the door, and they'd say, hey, you can't have it, so I'd rent another house and move the game over here, and rent a motel room and move it over there, and this went on for, probably 10 years. And I'd have crap games, and I graduated with the tickets that I would get from these clubs that was organized. Ironically, it was by Italians. It wasn't mob because it's a small town, but it was local. Everybody knew it. They looked the other way. And I found that I was giving them most of the tickets and booking little ones, and finally I saw how much money was into it. I went to a printer, had my own ticket printed, and put my own tickets in different color in all the factories in the northern Ohio area, along with my poker games and along with my crap games. And eventually we were having a big crap game at a local bar that was closed every Monday. A friend of mine owned this bar. So every Monday we would go to this place and we'd have a crap game. The FBI heard about it. Yeah, this was crazy. So here comes these 2 guys that are dressed up like FBI guys, and we're in the bar, and we had this crap table. It was like this table we're talking on. We would throw it on the roof of a car, and we would drive it to this bar, and we'd have this crap game. So we take it in, we haul it into the bar, we put it on the pool table, and here comes these 2 FBI guys. And they said, are you Alex Christoff? I said, yes, I am. And they said, is this your layout here? And I said, yes, it is. And they said, are you the guy that has football tickets in Cleveland, Lorain, and Toledo? These are big areas in Ohio. And I said, yes, I have football tickets in those areas. And they said, do you realize that the mob has tickets in those 3 areas? And I said, are you telling me that there's mob-operated things in Cleveland, Toledo, and Lorain, and you're here arresting me? And they said, son, they said, don't you realize that you could be hurt by messing with the mob's income. And I said, well, if you guys are so aware that the mob is operating in these places, how come you're chasing me? I'm just a guy with 4 kids. Why don't you go get a hold of those guys in Cleveland and Toledo and bother them? And they said, and now the 2 local, the local Italian guys who would close their joint to come to my crap game on Monday, they were all drunk up and they come in the joint and they said, let's get that goddamn crap game going. And they looked over and they seen these 2 they turned right around and walked out of the joint. And the FBI, and all the guys are sitting around the bar waiting for these guys to leave so we could go. They said, you guys might as well leave because there isn't going to be no crap game tonight. So they said, we're just giving you a friendly warning. So they left. They didn't take the table, so we put the table on top of the car roof. We drove it over to somebody's house and we put it in their basement. We had the crap game in the basement that same night. So much for the FBI. Then the local cops, I rented another house, put the crap table down. This is when I was getting ready to leave town. I didn't know it. Everybody's around the table. We're dealing cash, and I'm in the middle of the table. I got money this high. And everybody's got 2. And I had a guy on the goddamn door, excuse my language. He's a drunk hillbilly, but a great guy. He was supposed to be on the door. He's sleeping. The 2 detectives walk in the door. It's wide open. And I got 2 bail bondsmen, 2 lawyers, and 2 businessmen are all shooting at this table. And they walk in the door, and I looked up, and I see the cop, and I looked out this big pile of money. And they looked at me, and they smiled, and they said, no, you can't have none of that money. So they confiscated the money, and that's when they took me downtown. They took us all downtown, but the bail bondsmen bailed us right out right away because they were just shooting in the game. That's the kind of town it was. But they didn't give me the money back until in that following week, they made me draw up this agreement to leave Sandusky for a year, and that's when I decided to go to Las Vegas. And because they confiscated all my money, I must have had 20 guys contribute money, the $3,000 that bailed me out to get to Las Vegas. And then afterwards, my wife went down and they gave her the money back. They weren't interested in that. They just wanted to get me the hell out of town. And that's when I decided to come to Las Vegas and make many, many fortunes. Didn't keep any of them, but I made them. I had a 1962 Ford. I drove it nonstop to get to Vegas in one day. I drove 31 hours straight and got to Vegas. The first place I went was across from that drugstore on St. Louis and the Strip, whatever the heck it is, I don't even remember anymore. A pretty famous drugstore. I don't know if it's still there or not, it might be. And I rented a motel room called the Oasis Motel for a week. And then I took the proceeds of all my friends that loaned me money to get out of town and proceeded to be a professional crapshooter and lost it all. And then I proceeded to one of my Italian friends back home. His brother-in-law was the card room shift boss for Bill Boyd at the Golden Nugget, and his name was Oscar. I didn't see Oscar, but I went down there and asked to meet Bill Boyd, and I met him and convinced him that I would be a valuable asset to his poker room, so he hired me. I won't go through that rigmarole about how I got it, but I did get it. And I insisted that he hire me, and when I got done talking to him, he hired me on the spot. And so I worked there 2 weeks, and then as I pursued my career, now having a sheriff's card and a job, I would go door to door to various clubs where they had poker to try to convince whoever was there that I was now working at the Golden Nugget, but not telling the story, whatever the story was. I wasn't getting enough dealing time, I needed more money, I heard your club was fantastic, buttering up whoever I was talking to at the time. My second job was the Circus. And I worked at the Circus for approximately 12 months. And there were various situations developed at the Circus. Meanwhile, my family relocated to Las Vegas, had my first job, bought my first house, and was making $30 a day in tips, plus wages, which at the time might have been $25 a day, so it was like a $60 a day job. I had always, because of the games, the bootleg games I had at home, I always had the dexterity to deal anyway.
For Don Archer.
Don Archer was the man. How'd you know?
I knew him from Lake Tahoe.
Did you really? Don Archer was a very
straight.
like you, a very dry personality. And for some reason, I convinced him to hire me. And after that, he hired 8 guys from Sandusky, Ohio that I referred to him. And yet, I couldn't get close to this guy. Nobody could get close to Don Archer. He had the only 6-card stud game in the state of Nevada. There was 9 million 7-card stud poker games. He was convinced 6-card stud was the key to his success. But he had juice from Portland, Oregon, he was, at the Circus. And he loved to hire, ironically again, it was Dame Fortune, totally inexperienced, uncorrupted young dealers. And since he knew I just hit town, I hadn't had time to learn what he didn't think I had already learned in the back rooms and places in Ohio. So it ended up, I worked there for the 12 months and we had a difference of opinion, and he didn't treat me fairly. I didn't feel he did. And I left Circus and got hired with Johnny Moss at the Flamingo, which the difference, you would have to appreciate the difference between Don Archer and Johnny Moss.
The world famous gambler.
Yes, Johnny Moss, one of the greatest crossroad rounders, best legends in the history of the world.
First 2 World Series of Poker.
Yeah.
He was the winner.
World champion. I walked in off the street the same way I did with Bill Boyd and Don Archer and John Moss. And he sat me down and said, "Show me what you can do." So I said, "Okay, John." He said, "You're hired." As soon as he saw that I knew how to take the money with both hands, and that's the story I was starting to tell you, because they had the drop slot. And in a normal situation, nowadays, an 8-hour shift, they take the box out no matter what's in there. When you work for Johnny Moss, he would take the box out 3 times a day, 3 times in an 8-hour period. If you couldn't fill up the box, which would keep him in money because he gambled like crazy, and these are dollar chips you're taking, it was hilarious what we could take and what we would take. They had a lot, back then the Gaming Commission didn't know it. You had to post a sign of how much you would rake in a poker game. The Golden Nugget had a little sign about this big that said 0 to 25%. Johnny Moss had a sign this big that said 0 to 100%. You know what that means. You don't have to be a mathematician to figure that out. You could take it all. But they pacified the Gaming Commission by posting a sign. They didn't think anybody would be dumb enough to take it all. But we used to have, if we had bad games, we would have dealer tournaments to see if we could take more money out of the pot so that the guy that won the hand would have less money than he started with. Now that was fun. The guy would start with $100, win the pot, we push it to him, by the time he'd stack it up, he'd have 80. And at that time, and all of it was stud all over town except the Nugget. People were just that dumb. But after a year, it got so bad. Again, Johnny Moss, I think Henderson Elm maybe, there were 3 card rooms. Legends could lease a card room from the casino, and they would, in essence, pay them rent. And then they had their own little sign. The Flamingo would put a postcard in every room and say, "Please don't play poker in our card room. It's not part of the hotel, and it's crooked." They'd still play.
Wow.
They wouldn't read the sign and they'd come in there.
That's true.
It was outrageous. It was literally outrageous. And when the box got full, we used to have button-down shirts with pockets everywhere. Just pockets everywhere. Yeah, Jesus. I'd have
The sub. Tell me
three
about the sub.
3 buttons on a white shirt. I'd just keep throwing chips in there. There would be various places I'd have to walk, when I'd get up from the table, I'd have to walk like this to carry all the chips. It was hilarious. It was just totally crazy. But it didn't matter. The beauty of it is, you couldn't steal enough to stay in money, because as soon as you got off the shift, you'd move around to the other side of the table and you'd play whatever you played. I had a couple of guys, I had people working for me. We would take, forget what we'd make for the company. We would make $500 a night. And just to use this man for an instance. We would have to borrow $20 the next day so that he could come in and sit down, and then I could start pushing the money to him because I didn't have enough room. There'd be dealers in other clubs. There was a dealer, again, working at the circus when I was at the place, the Flamingo. He'd say, we're looking for a guy that can take chips off the table. I said, take chips off the table? That is no chore. So I wore a windbreaker, and I sat, he was dealing here, and I was in the 5 seat, which would be directly across from him. And that was Don Archer's six card stud game, and he can testify to this. He'd shuffle up the cards, he'd do it, and I looked down, I'd have a set of trips. Now trips in 6 card stud is just outrageous.
Big game.
And all the tourists would be in there firing up the money, and then I'd end up with it, I'd stack it up and put a stack or two in my pockets, can of those things, and next thing I know, he'd shuffle them up. I looked down, I have another set of trips. He was right, you just couldn't keep up with the money. Within an hour, I'd have $300 or $400. Everything on me was hanging out, and then I'd have to waddle away and cash out and get all these chips. Then we'd chop it up down the middle, and next day we'd go someplace else and go do it all over again. And there'd always be 2 or 3 dealers that were extremely talented. I never had the talent like this guy had. I had other skills. But it was just a ball of fun back then. That was, again, I call it BC, before cameras. And after the Gaming Commission finally saw Billy Smith from the Stardust, Johnny Moss, Henderson Al from the Dunes, that there was actually a lot of undeclared revenue, they posted these $3 max, $5 max, whatever it was, and they did away with the drop slot, and they put the handle down, and you couldn't drop it until after the hand was over and everybody could theoretically see you do it. And all that ended. And then they put cameras on, although there are some guys that could still shuffle the cards and deal hands out, but in theory, you wouldn't know when cameras were on or when they weren't on. So that was around 1980. But in the early 70s, that was the tail end of mob-operated Argent, Stardust, and all those kind of things. Once the cameras got in pretty much every place. I was at Stardust. I went from Johnny Moss, finally. I went back and I got hired at the Stardust, which was, again, probably the second premier room. There was the Gold Nugget, the Stardust, and of course the Dunes was a den of inequity. You just couldn't go to the Dunes unless you're a part of the clique. And people who knew me from back home and around, they said, well, how come you don't go to the Dunes? Why don't you go to the Dunes again? I said, you can't win at the Dunes. At the time, everything was 15, 30, 10, 20, things like that.
Big games.
The Dunes was 30 and 60 and 40 and 80 and 50 and 100. But if you weren't in the combine or if you weren't at the right situation, it was unbeatable. We would have dealers at the Stardust that were literal cheaters, and they would take all their money and go to the Dunes and constantly go broke. And we'd talk about it at the break room, and we'd say, Danny Monsky, he killed himself. Danny, why do you go up there? You know it's crooked. He said, but man, every time I look down, I got the second best hand you could possibly get. The second best hand. What's it take? Danny, what do you want to do? Danny was so well liked, nice guy. He beat the Shylocks for a couple $1,000s and ran out of town. They went out, got him, brought him back, put him on the payroll, and so he could get even and so on and so forth. And it ended up he was $10,000 in debt, and they found him with the gun in his hand, and he had shot himself in the head. $10,000 poorer. But that was, without saying, everybody knew Danny Monsky would not have killed himself like that. There were 3 people at the Stardust that died in a strange manner in the year that I was there. But
that was during the time that Tony Spilotro was.
Exactly. Tony Spilotro ran the
and
place.
Letty Rosenthal was.
Yes.
Stardust.
I worked that period. And the movie Casino, that was the biography of the Stardust. And that movie was totally accurate. That was exactly how it was run. The only differences is the 2 scenes. The scene where the cowboy has his feet on the table, and they take him in the back room and they beat the shit out of, they threaten him.
Mm-hmm.
In real life, they dragged him off the table and beat the shit out of him right in the card room. They didn't haul him in the back room, they beat him right there.
Wow.
That was a crazy experience. I was working a table at the Stardust, in the old Stardust in the back room. The card room was in the back, and there was an exit door right there. And what looked like a custodian was pushing one of those tremendous garbage bag. Yeah, thank you. A garbage bag situation. And here was this round thing was about this big, and on top of it was your regular black bags that you see where people haul leaves and everything. And this thing, the top bag falls off of the garbage, that thing's on a roller. The bag splits open, and all it is bundles of cash. Bundles of cash. And they were hauling it out the back door at the time. And that's when Argent, they had raided the Fremont and found the coin things were weighted and this and that and the other, and how they were taking the money out. And if you remember in the movie Casino, where the guys, they're sorting the money and the guy walks in and peels all this money off. And that's what they was doing, just like that, just like the movie. Initially, Binions would have the thing, and it was kind of like a family reunion situation. All the old timers, it would be 2 or 3 tables, even 1 table to start with. Then it got to be 2, 3, 4, and before you know it, not only the best players, or the best well-known players, but it spread out, and all the mom and pops want to gravitate around these people that, the legends, Johnny Moss, Bill Boyd, all these people that Nick the Greek was way before my time.
And others.
Which guy?
Amarillo Slim.
Oh, Amarillo Slim, of course. Yeah, he was.
Puggy Pearson.
Oh, Puggy, all those guys. I built
Jimmy
all.
Casella.
Yeah.
Layoff Bookie.
Yeah. There was just so many of them. And then once it got to be multiple tables, they didn't have a full-time staff to work that World Series all the time. So they would put feelers out and ask if anybody would like to deal that. Or at one time, Eric Drake, he doesn't get much credit, but at the time, Eric Drake was the best liked, best card room manager that probably ever hit the state of Las Vegas, the state of Nevada. Eric Drake had an impeccable reputation, and his personality. He could see you one time for a minute, you come back 10 years later and he'd say, "Hi Ed, how you doing?" The guy had an encyclopedia this big. He was just name recall, and his personality, at that time when stud was king, he was probably the 8th best stud player in the state. And his problem and his ego was he always wanted to play with the best 7. And he'd always be in debt.
Yep.
But he was so personable and so good. He had comp privileges with everybody. Everybody would throw money at him. He lived like he lived like Steve Wynn and didn't have a quarter of his own, but everybody just liked him, and he managed things well. And unfortunately for
He also ended up being producer on some of those first poker programs that were on TV.
Yeah, terrific guy, and he's still alive. He worked the Hustler for whoever the Hustler guy is. Flynn, is that his name?
Yep, Larry Flynn.
Yeah, he got in with Larry Flynn and run the casino in California. He comes out here still. I see him maybe once a year. He's fallen out a little bit of hard times. He don't live like a millionaire anymore, but he's got a billion memories. And I had never heard of anybody say a cross word about Eric Drake.
No.
Have you ever saw anybody better than him?
He was so on the square, he couldn't make any money.
Yeah, yeah. But he lived beyond his means pretty well.
Yep.
It was kind of like a family reunion of all the guys that knew the ins and outs. Everybody, a lot of guys knew everybody by their first names. They knew who the best dealers were. And at one time, Eric thought I was one of the top 10 dealers in town. I don't know if that was the case, maybe just like me. But they would try to get a lot of real good dealers in there. And everybody was generous, to be quite frank with you, much more so than now,
Oh, yeah.
because it was smaller. And Mr. Binion, I refer to him as Mr. Binion. Everybody knows him as Benny Binion and so on. I did have breakfast a couple times with him. I had a couple complaints one time. I got to know him personally. He always treated me super good because no matter where I got my money from, I was very loyal. I always brought it down to Binion's because I could bet high, and he always kept me eating well. and he was just the old crossroad. I read his biography, and I bought maybe 2 books on him. Now here's a guy whose instincts, gambling instincts, were so good. He created this thing that is keeping Harris Corporation afloat. I mean, it grew, and it would have continually grown. Unfortunately, and Jack Binion inherited a lot of his father's charisma, his business sense. He did a great job. But then they had the family squabble that ruined the whole scenario. And that was unfortunate.
Yeah, then Teddy killed himself.
Yeah, Teddy got, that was horrible. But it was, when Mr. Binion had the situation, you could go into, this was the buffet of all buffets. They'd have shrimp as high as this table, as far as the eye could see, every berry, every melon in season, places you couldn't even get this stuff. Steaks, prime rib, the order, he would dang near feed the whole town. I mean, you could walk in, people that knew how to walk in, he'd just feed everybody. Just feed everybody.
The World Series of Poker, the first 4 years, they quit playing.
Yeah.
And everybody go downstairs for the dinner at the same time, and it was just like that, whatever you wanted.
Yeah.
And
It was fantastic.
And
And
some
it-
of the old timers used to tell stories just like this, and Jack
Yeah.
Binion still has the tapes. I'd love to hear all those stories again.
Yeah, I can remember dealing, well, when I dealt that thing a few times, where it was, I consider it commonplace. In the course of a game, you might get, in the course of a day, I would get 4 or 5 black chips, $100 tips. And when I went to, the first time I went with Johnny Moss at the Flamingo, I got black chips. And when you're a country boy afraid out of Ohio, and all of a sudden they're throwing black chips at you, you're thinking, man, I have arrived. I mean, that was almost enough to keep me in money till tomorrow. Almost. It's all relevant. If it's the kind of a game where you've got big name people for big name money, and you've handled yourself in a professional manner. Normally, in the old days, it would be nickels, quarters, and an occasional 100. And at the end of a night, if a guy came up with a big number, it could even be more than 100. You know, I dealt one time where I saw Chip Reese. Chip Reese is from Dayton, Ohio. I'm from Sandusky. There was one night when he was just graduated from 15 and 30 to 50 and 100. He and a guy named Danny Robinson were partners, and he won like $50,000 or $100,000. And I saw him tip the floor man a $500 bill. And me and the other guy that dealt the game, he tipped us each $25, which was kind of insulting under the circumstances. But again, and I've said in another article, Doyle Brunson, I've dealt to Doyle Brunson off and on now. This is not every day or every week, but in 40 years with Doyle Brunson, I have yet to receive the first dollar. Now I know people that say Doyle Brunson has, now he has a room at the Bellagio, I believe, and they say that Doyle Brunson, a dealer that I would believe told me Doyle Brunson is tipping $25 chips. My heart almost gave out. I would have to see this. I believe the dealer, I trust him. But after 40 years of watching Doyle Brunson not tip at all, he never he was not a bad person to deal to. He never said a harsh word, never criticized you. He just didn't tip. But you will find in the professional ranks in the old days, they tipped for service or out of respect if your ability was good. If it was a bad dealer, of course, it was negligible. But at the same time, when these guys play thousands of hands a year, they couldn't possibly tip all the time or every hand, because at the end of 365 days, that could be $50,000. Whereas a guy like you or I, who's here on a vacation, where you might get $1 or nothing from a pro, you might get $25 from a tourist, or at least a $5 or a $10 bill, because it's recreational for them. They're having a good time. These guys that do it for a living, you look at the big picture, so you can understand some of it, but some of it you can't. It's just iffy. Well, number one is Johnny Moss.
Yeah.
Because I worked for him 5 times, and he was the kind of guy, he was a crossroader, and if you went to Johnny and said, I'm broke, I need a job, he'd say, come in at such and such a time, and he would tip. And then you'd put together a bankroll and you'd think you were a player, so then you'd quit the job and you'd go play and you'd go broke and you'd come back and say, Johnny, I need a job. So Johnny's my favorite all time. I could do no wrong with Johnny Moss, and I love the guy. A lot of people didn't like him, I do. Puggy Pearson. Now, I don't recall that Puggy Pearson was ever tipped me, but Puggy Pearson he's from Tennessee. He had a down-home Southern accent. And in the old days, they were very strict. When you dealt to this group of people, you never called a hand, you never said a word, you held the deck, you dummied up and you dealt. You just couldn't say nothing. And Puggy Pearson was so funny. I mean, he could call you an MF, but the way he did it was hilarious. And this one particular memoir I had, I'm sitting there, and he's got this little bitty cigar that he always used to smoke, and he'd be chewing on that cigar, and he'd be running bad. And I'm just sitting there holding the deck, looking at the table. And he kept just reading me the riot act, just calling it, not necessarily names, I don't recall verbatim, but what he was saying was so funny. I set the deck down, I bust out laughing, and I apologized. I said, Puggy, I said, I know I'm not supposed, I said, you're so goddamn funny, I just can't help myself. And that kind of broke him up. Now, he's got a brother, J.C. Pearson, and in street language, he's a total piece of shit. He couldn't carry his brother's jock. I don't care if he took $100 bills. J.C. Pearson is a bum. Puggy Pearson was hilarious. I enjoyed him a lot. Stu Younger, one of the best players I ever met, but as a human being, what I saw of him, he was another total waste. I had many altercations with Stu Younger in his brief career and in my later years where we didn't quite have the respect for professional players. He was mean. And he was a dwarf. He's about this big, weighed about 100 pounds. And he'd sit close to you, and he'd take the cards and not throw them in or push them in. He'd use them, those plastic cards that cut your hands. And he'd try to cut your hands. And he was sitting in the 2-seat, and he threw them at me. And this had been after I'd been in the business for a double-digit amount of years. And this was not for Johnny Moss at the time. This was for somebody else. And I looked at him and I said, Stewie, I says, if you ever throw those effing cards at me again like that, I'm coming across the table and I'm squeezing that pimply head of yours right off your effing shoulders. And he got up and he moved around to the 5-seat. He wasn't going to stand where I could grab him. And I'm not a fighter, I'm not an aggravating person, but this guy was so bad, I definitely would have hurt him, because I had disdain for the guy, other than his ability. He was very good. My compulsion, and I told someone else, I said, this is a flawed city built by flawed people to entertain flawed people. So if you're not flawed, or you don't crave to be around it, you shouldn't be here. And my particular, they say booze, broads, dope, gambling. If you don't love one of those four things, what the hell are you doing here? My particular one is craps. And my description of my love for craps is, if I had a choice between the movie star of your choice or a good crap game, the female would have to go down by the wayside. Craps is more exciting than sex. It's an outrageous game. For the person that doesn't have what it takes to be a successful gambler, and I told people it takes discipline, patience, and there's a third one. I said something like, I don't recall what it was strategy, integrity. If you don't have any of those three things, you will never be successful as a gambler. And they asked, again, someone asked me, well, how do you stack up? And I said, well, I love Las Vegas, but I have three problems. And they asked me, well, what are the three problems? I don't have discipline, I don't have patience, and I'm a little weak on integrity. So therefore, I'm still dealing poker. But I wouldn't have changed much of it. I had an exciting time. But where I would like to see gaming in the future is impossible. It will never be that way again.
Yeah.
No. Initially, my first experience in 1963, I got out of the service in 63. I brought my wife here when Caesar's Palace opened. We got a week stay there at $40 a night. And when it was operated by not a known corporation, you could fly into Las Vegas and they would pay for your airfare, your room, and all your food. Just show up. When that syndicate left and the corporations took over and they gave you those little plastic cards for mom and pops, and they monitor, now you can't go to the toilet without having to pay for it. If you came with $10,000, the object of the bean counters, as we call them when you're not in the business, they want to make a profit in the toilet. When the mob ran it, they gave you everything. In my theory, unfortunately, I'm not a bean counter. If you and I came in with $10,000 and they gave us everything, and we lost the whole $10,000, why do you have to compartmentalize who got what of your $10,000? You've got it all. But nowadays, the shoe shine guy, the gift shop, blah, 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 blah. But the $10,000 that you and I would lose, by the time they get done charging us for everything, we only got $200 to gamble with. If you can get the whole 10 grand, what's the difference if you feed them and give them a room to stay and an airplane ticket to get there? And because it's not, everything is corporate, everything is impersonal, unless you're from China or who the hell knows where, putting millions of dollars in the bank, just like Robert De Niro says at the end of the movie. If you got a whale coming in, what do? You got a bean counter getting a social security number and his birth date, and how much is he going to spend? I mean, so you see everybody dressed in shorts and t-shirts where it used to be closed, Yeah. It's just not the same. It's a business, and there's enough mom and pops, and it's spreading all over the world, but it will never, ever be as glamorous as it was. As I am in my last year of my career, I have talked about it, and my son, who followed in my footsteps, he is now retired. It should have been unionized while the mob was here. And now that it's corporate, it should definitely be unionized. The problem with it is there are millions, slight exaggeration, of people working at McDonald's and Burger King and coming from Mexico and China and everywhere in the world, and they're working these menial jobs, and they come to a gambling capital, not necessarily Las Vegas, could be anywhere in the world. But you take someone that's making a minimum wage and you give them 3 times more than they ever were. And guys like myself, they say, hey, if you don't like it, go down the road. There's probably a slight exaggeration, maybe there's 50 dealer schools in this town, just in this town. And they pump them out like hot dogs. So what chance does a guy with 30 years experience have if they can throw you out the door and bring in this young kid from Burger King, and all of a sudden, instead of making $10, $15 a day, he's making 40. Forget the quality of what he knows, because he doesn't know anything. But if you as a player, or me as a player, are willing to put up with this, to be part of this glitz and glamour that used to be, why should we give you quality if you're going to settle? Why should we give you steak if you're going to take bologna? And there's just too much bologna out here. It should have been done 40 years ago.
Wow.
It should be done right now,
Yeah.
but it won't be, because they don't have to. There was one time in the old days, just at the borderline, when Binion's was just about to fold, Becky Binion and them. It was the final event. It was like 3 days to go, and the dealers sat down and had a strike at Binion's. And the guy that was under Becky's husband and the fellow named George Bowman.
Nick Bana.
Yeah. They sat down before the final event, and they said, and I'm pretty sure this is right because I was working it at the time. I wasn't one of the 100 because I was a regular dealer, but 100 dealers sat down and said they would not deal the final event if they didn't guarantee us $100,000. And it was a matter of hours, and Nick and Becky got together. I don't know if you even knew this, Mark, but they said they would guarantee the 100,000, but whatever player tokes came in, they would keep the player tips against the 100,000, which was probably fair. We probably still dealer proportion, by the time you broke it down 200 ways, roughly, there were 200 dealers. So you split 100,000 200 ways. But, and then they took the player tokes. In the old days at Binion's, the players would all tip. The guys that won these things, they would be big tips. But nowadays at Harris, they don't, one of the professional players years ago got together and said, hey, Harris has taken X number of dollars from every entry fee, therefore don't tip. Some professional players actually said don't tip, so they stopped doing that, and now the dealers get a percentage of the buy-ins, which there's something to be said for that, but it lacks the charisma or the charm of the old days. And it's just one of those things that, again, it has evolved into the business, and it just isn't the same.
Right after that dealer strike is when Harvey's bought the Horseshoe. And
Right.
they named the Horseshoe. Harvey's basically all melded into Caesar's Palace Corporation. And they purchased the rights to the World Series of Poker and the name the Horseshoe, because Jack Binion, several years prior to that, had split from Becky and the family, gone to the Mississippi River into Ohio,
Tunica.
and opened up casinos under the Horseshoe name, because he had the rights to the Horseshoe name the rest of the world, but not Nevada. And they purchased that name. Then they purchased Jack Binion's places. That's also part of the Caesars properties now. The main reason Becky had run that place into the ground, and they paid about $50,000 basically, or $50 million, excuse me, to get the poker, the World Series of Poker, and the name. I think it was not 50 million, more like about 10 or 12 or something.
Less than 10.
Yeah, for the building, the name, everything.
But then right after that is when it exploded too.
Yes.
The bean counters are stupid. Running a card room, I've told, we didn't even get into this, but I approached people 20 years, 30 years before this ever hit. I knew poker would be a boom for this this city, for gambling in general. And I can explain basically the problem. When you see, it's these plastic cards. It's these plastic cards. When you see a poker person, any poker person, you have this plastic card. But before that, you had a card room. You got me. You got this gentleman over here. You got yourself. You sit in a poker game. We have significant others. We have family members. They want to compartmentalize the slots, the blackjack, or the sports book, blah, 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 blah. What happens is, I'm playing poker, in my case. I lose one hand. I lose another hand. I go on tilt. I lost $150 in poker. What do? Do I go home and go to bed and piss myself off? Hell no, I run over to the crap table. I buy in 500 or 1,000. Boom, I fire it off. What they don't realize, because they don't have this little plastic card to follow you around, a poker person will play craps, 21, roulette. He'll go bet a sports book bet, a whole big thing. You don't need a card to snap that thing up. What the casino managers don't know is, unless it's like Bobby Baldwin. Bobby Baldwin deserves a lot of credit, even though he had college education. I dealt to Bobby Baldwin, never had any personal things, but he's a poker player. He was smart enough to know poker generated a lot, and he talked to Steve Wynn, who was smart enough to have confidence in Bobby Baldwin, and they blew this thing up where Steve Wynn always makes his money, because he is a little bit of a bean counter, but Bobby Baldwin had street hustle and street intelligence to tell him what I'm telling you right now. There are intangibles about poker that these guys don't factor in. They're so busy looking at their computer departmentals, they don't realize that these guys go for all this stuff. And when they're going for it, they ain't got time to hold out their plastic card and all that crap. When you got that heat and somebody just showed you a set of quads or a gut shot at the river, you're not reaching for your card, you're reaching for your bankroll to go out there and fire it up. And that's all they need, is to get, like I told somebody else this thing, which is absurd. You got to pay $10 to park your car. Now this is a true life experience, I can tell you. 2 weeks ago, I'm driving down the road and I was going to go see a dealer. I mean, you deal all over the city, you know dealers every place. But in my mind, it's like $10 for a bag of groceries or $10 to park my car. And at the time, I got $1,000 in my pocket. Now that might not be a whole lot of money, but there's a whole bunch of guys like me that got $1,000 in their pocket. I'm driving, I want to go see this guy that's dealing at the Bellagio. I'll be a son of a bitch if I'm going to pay $10 to go say hello to this guy, and probably belly up, because I can't walk past any crap table in the city without making a lay down. So I'm going to save the $10. Where did I go? I went to Stations, because Stations is smart enough not to charge you. And what happened? 3 minutes later, Station won my $1,000. Now Bellagio don't need my 1,000, but magnify that by 1,000 people in this town. 1,000 people. If I rent a casino right now, if you parked in my parking garage, I'd give you bring your validation, I'd give you $10. Bet it on any game you want. Now, once you're there, once the three of us are in any club, you pick a spot, we're parking the car, we get our $10 free play, roulette, craps, blackjack, I don't care. Once you blow that 10, are you going to jump in your car and go drive somewhere else? Hell no. You're going to make another bet of some kind. So that free $10 bill ain't nothing. And these idiots are going to charge you $10 so that you can go broke? That's insulting. How dumb do they think the tourists are? Or are they going to get all the Arabs and Chinese people in the world to come in here, or the mom and pops, because they're from Podunk, Kentucky or Ohio? And they're going, oh, well, it's $10, we're on a vacation. Big deal. Where's the class in that? Where is the class? It's just ignorant. It's irritating. That's my philosophy on that.